And now for our feature presentation.
Hello, dear listener. I'm Megan, host of this series, and before we get into the show, I wanted to take a minute to tell you about our sponsor, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We live in a moment when free speech, the bedrock of our democracy and of all free societies, is often viewed as suspect, where many argue that the right to free speech is too dangerous, and that even listening to ideological opponents is morally wrong. Many people just don't see a problem with using the law, corporate power, and even extraordinary social pressure to censor viewpoints they disagree with. But many of us feel the costs of all this in our everyday lives. We feel it when we self-censor, afraid to say what we really think, sometimes even in private conversations with friends or loved ones. We feel it when we opt out of a growing number of public discussions, afraid of the potential cost to our jobs and even our relationships. FIRE shares a mission with this show, to remind us why a culture of free speech and open dialogue matters. And regardless of how loud the calls for censorship are, FIRE's defense of that culture is unshakable and invaluable. And if you want to remember why we choose freedom, even for people we strenuously disagree with, you can learn more about FIRE's incredible work at thefire.org. And now, on to the show. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Joseph Campbell. Chapter 1. Plotted in Darkness.
Hello there. Sorry to bother you. I'm making a podcast, and I'm going to be asking a lot of fans a lot of questions all weekend, and you're one of the people not staring at your phone. So I thought maybe start with this fellow.
Sure.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. For starters, why do you like Harry Potter?
I don't know. I think I had not such a great childhood, and I think a kid with not such a great childhood actually escaped to something else in a book.
It's a story about acceptance and love.
Harry Potter has been kind of like a beacon of hope in a lot of times in my life.
Teaches, the importance of friendships, the importance of forgiveness.
He felt like an outsider, and he felt like he didn't belong, and that really resonated with me.
The way people pull together, they're different. They don't all exactly agree with one another, but they can say, okay, this is the common good, and this is what we're going to work for.
What about the author? What about J.K. Rowling?
That's a tricky question.
So there's a lot of controversy with that one.
I'm trying to stay out of it.
So I have a comment I'll say off the thing.
Let me...
J.K. Rowling is one of the most successful authors in the history of publishing. And for the past 25 years, she's also been one of the most beloved. Her books have taught tens of millions of children worldwide about virtues like loyalty and courage, about the inclusion of outsiders and the celebration of difference. But in the summer of 2020, Rowling published a string of tweets about one of the most polarizing subjects in society right now: sex and gender. She waded into a conflict about transgender rights and the way she believed some activists were eroding hard-won rights for women. There was an explosive reaction to Rowling's tweets, which led many, including lifelong fans of her work, to condemn her and to call for her books to be banned, boycotted, and in some cases, burned.
So let me talk about the infamous book burning video for a second. I am not just offended by what J.K. Rowling says. I am fearful because of what she is promoting on her platform.
J.K. Rowling is literally putting trans lives at further risk. She just is. It's disgusting and it's problematic. I mean, let's face it, Hermione would punch this woman in the face right now.
The Harry Potter franchise is literally making this world unsafe for kids today.
Rowling was denounced by people she'd worked with for years, by staff at her publishers, and by human rights organizations that had once lauded her. Actors who had grown up on the Harry Potter film sets, people she had known since they were children, distanced themselves from her. Die-hard fans got their Harry Potter tattoos removed. Some called for anyone supporting Rowling, even in small ways, to be fired from their jobs. The condemnation moved to rallies, where Rowling became a symbol.
You are murdering trans children! Get up on time!
My name is Megan, and I spent the first 26 years of my life in a strict, fundamentalist Christian community. The beliefs of my church were the complete embodiment of my identity and my worldview. My family taught me that we were on a mission from God Himself, warning the world that they were going to hell if they didn't repent and live as we lived. And I was a true believer, certain that I was 100% right. Until I wasn't. 10 years ago, even though I knew it would cost me almost every relationship I had, including with my parents, who I love so much, I left. I've spent the decades since investigating belief and how it compels us to act and identify, and how it colors and shapes the world we inhabit. And reading Rowling's tweets, and then her transformation in the eyes of many who had loved her, it surprised me. Because growing up, it was my community that thought J.K. Rowling was evil, and it was other Christian fundamentalists who had amassed in force to condemn Rowling and to call her work dangerous.
The Harry Potter books are mainstreaming witchcraft to our children.
They had denounced her. They tried to ban Harry Potter from schools and libraries, and in some cases, they burned her books.
God hates this. I mean, He really hates it. It's darkness, and He is light. It is evil.
It's a stepping stone, kind of like marijuana leading to crack. The little kids, they don't know the difference. The adults do, and that's a shame on those parents that have their little kids read it. When their kids commit suicide, I told them so. They've been warned.
Despite its unparalleled popularity, Harry Potter is actually among the most banned books of the 21st century. And Rowling, even though she's inspired profound adoration throughout her career, with fans all over the planet, she's also been the subject of intense, widespread, and vocal backlashes from people whose politics could not be more at odds. And for the past year, I've been trying to figure out why. What is it about this woman and her work that has captured the ire of very different groups of people across time? How did Rowling understand her critics? And what did she think would happen when she sent those tweets? And so I decided to write her a letter. I explained who I was and what I was trying to understand, and then I sent it off to her in Scotland. And to my surprise, I heard back.
I never set out to upset anyone. However, I was not uncomfortable with getting off my pedestal. And what has interested me over the last 10 years, and certainly in the last few years, the last 2-3 years, particularly on social media, you've ruined your legacy. Oh, you could have been beloved forever, but you chose to say this. And I think you could not have misunderstood me more profoundly. I do not walk around my house thinking about my legacy. what a pompous way to live your life, walking around thinking, what will my legacy be? Whatever, I'll be dead. I care about now. I care about the living.
After I left Rowling's home, I spoke to reporters and historians, transgender adults, teens and advocates, doctors and lawyers, and many of Rowling's critics, including some who supported book bans. And one of the things that stood out to me was how people on all sides of this conflict felt so under attack, so threatened, that they invoked the language of witch hunts, even as they vehemently disagreed on who was the witch and who was the mob lighting the fire. I'm Megan Phelps Roper, and these are the witch trials of J.K. Rowling.
Great. Well, if you guys have water, you sound good. I'm going to put on these headphones.
Shall we close that door? It might need to be locked, actually.
Last summer, J.K. Rowling invited me to her 16th century stone house, where she lives with her husband, her younger children, and 2 dogs. Later, I would Google the place and learn that it's technically a castle, which, from the outside, makes sense. But inside it felt smaller, cozy even. The rooms were not high-vaulted and lofty, but snug and homey. Think more Hobbits in the Shire, less Princess in a Tower. Rowling was also smaller in real life than I would have guessed. She showed my producer and me into her drawing room, filled with books that she'd color-coordinated into a rainbow over the pandemic lockdown. And it was here that we would sit together over the course of the next few days and talk.
Get big, deep breaths.
Yoga move?
All right.
Let's do it.
Okay, so I want to start with a big question. Why do you think we humans, especially young kids, why do we like stories about witches and wizards and giants and dark magic? What is it about us? And what is it about magic and magical worlds that we find so compelling?
I'm very interested in this because I think it speaks to something very profound in human nature. Magic gives a person agency they wouldn't otherwise have. And I think that's particularly appealing to a child because children inevitably are quite powerless. Even children in happy families are relatively powerless. And the idea that you have secret power, extraordinary power, supernatural power, I think is hugely seductive to all of us, to adults as well, but particularly to children.
I want to go back to the early days, and I know you've talked about this period in your life so much over the years, this time just before Harry Potter was published. But I also know that our stories aren't static. They shift over the time with the benefit of hindsight and new experiences and just where you are in life when you're telling the story again.
I know exactly what you mean. You're right. I've been asked 1 million times about the moment when I had the idea on the train. Mm-hmm. And I've said it so many times, but you do look back and suddenly you stumble into this little pool of self-knowledge or memory that can be so illuminating. So I had the idea for Potter on a train when I was 25. Why did that idea come? I've never really known. It just fell into my head, and I immediately thought, I've got to write that. God, I love that idea. The funny thing is, I was never a great reader of fantasy. The thing that interests me most is human nature, above anything else.
Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense.
But there was something about this particular story.
Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of Scotch tape.
This boy who was unhappy and without any power, suddenly realizing what he had and who he was.
The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a lightning bolt. He had had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had gotten it.
Can you take me back to your life in the 1990s? I've heard you describe that time as essentially your greatest fear come to life.
Yeah, the early 90s for me were not good. I was in a real period of flux at the time. My mother was very ill. I had moved from London to Manchester. And then my mother died actually on the night of December the 30th, 1990, but I didn't realize she died until the early hours of New Year's Eve. She was 45. She'd been ill for a very long time, but none of us realized death was imminent. That kind of took a wrecking ball to my life, really. To me, this decade now was infused with loss. And I think, perhaps that would have colored my feelings about the story I was writing. Perhaps that would have made me want to put it away forever. But in fact, that sense of loss and this real despair that I felt started to go into the story.
Harry was so close to the mirror now that his nose was nearly touching that of his reflection. "Mum?" he whispered. "Dad?"
At that point, the story changed. Suddenly, everything darkened and deepened.
They just looked at him, smiling. And slowly, Harry looked into the faces of the other people in the mirror and saw other pairs of green eyes like his, other noses like his, even a little old man who looked as though he had Harry's knobbly knees.
The story that Rowling had begun to write on the train that day was about an orphan boy.
I slightly glibly used the trope for 6 months before my mother died. In reality, of course, is a tragedy to be an orphan.
This fictional orphan, Harry Potter, was abused and neglected and never told about who he really is, who his parents really were, or how they had died to save him.
And now I really understood what loss was.
Harry was looking at his family for the first time in his life. The Potters smiled and waved at Harry, and he stared hungrily back at them, his hands pressed flat against the glass, as though he was hoping to fall right through it and reach them. He had a powerful kind of ache inside him, half joy, half terrible sadness.
This little manuscript that only I knew this story. No one else had seen it. I hadn't spoken about it really to anyone else. This was the thing that I just clutched onto as I went off on my journeys.
In 1991, at the age of 25, Rowling broke up with her boyfriend, quit her job, and she left the UK.
I decided I need to get away.
She got a job teaching English as a foreign language.
I went abroad. I knew that I liked teaching, and so I thought, I'm just going to go away. I'm going to take a year out, I'll teach. I don't really know why, but I chose to go to Portugal. And initially it did the job. I'm away, I'm in a different environment, this is helping me. But I think that emotionally I was still incredibly vulnerable. Well, in fact, I know I was emotionally vulnerable. So while there was a lot of fun and there was relief in not being surrounded by the familiar, I was pretty lost. and pretending not to be lost.
Still grieving, unsure of what her future held, Rowling says she tried to put on a good face and move forward. And pretty soon, she met someone.
So you go to Portugal and you meet a guy.
I did. I met a guy. I think I'd been there 6 months maybe, in a bar with my friends, good-looking guy, told me he was a journalist. We began dating. It was okay. It was okay. I'd lost my moorings, and I was drifting along in something that wasn't perfect, but it was good to be wanted. It was good to have affection. But I was kind of adrift.
The months went by, and eventually, they decided to move into an apartment together. A year came, and it went.
And then I became pregnant accidentally. And while pregnant, he proposed to me. And then I lost the baby. I miscarried, which was hugely traumatic. It was traumatic physically and it was traumatic emotionally. And that was another massive loss. And I think at that point, I really was in a very, I was certainly not in a balanced state of mind. And when I lost the baby, I do remember having a moment, in my grief for the baby, I do remember having a moment where I thought, so we're not going to get married. That's clear, right? And I'm almost speaking to myself, that's clear, Joe, we're not going to marry this guy. But he was putting huge pressure on me to get married. So I went through with it and then became pregnant almost immediately we were married, which is a joyful thing because I cannot imagine a world without my Jessica in it. So in with all the bad, there was an amazing, wonderful thing came out of it, and that was my daughter.
But as I understand it, even before your daughter was born, your husband had become increasingly abusive.
Yeah. The situation was a bad situation, but until you actually go through it, you don't know what you would choose to do.
Rowling says she tried to end things.
I left him twice before I left for good, and then I went back twice.
But it just got worse from there.
The marriage at this point has turned very violent and very controlling. At this point, he's searching my handbag every time I come home. I haven't got a key to my own front door because he's got to control the front door. And I think he's not a stupid person. I think he knew or suspected that I was going to try and bolt again. It was a horrible state of tension to live in because you have to act. And I don't think I'm a very good actor. I don't have a very good poker face. And that was a huge strain to act as though I wasn't going. That's a terrible way to live. And yet, the manuscript kept growing. I'd continued to write. In fact, he knew what that manuscript meant to me because at a point, he took the manuscript and hid it. And that was his hostage.
Oh my God.
When I realized that I was definitely going to go, this was it, I was definitely going, I would take a few pages of the manuscript into work every day, just a few pages so he wouldn't realize anything was missing, and I would photocopy it. And gradually in a cupboard in the staff room, bit by bit, a photocopied manuscript grew and grew and grew because I suspected that if I wasn't able to get out with everything, he would burn it or take it or hold it hostage. That manuscript still meant so much to me. That was the thing that actually I prioritized saving. The only thing I prioritized beyond that, obviously, was my daughter. But at that point, she's still inside me, so she's as safe as she can be in that situation.
In July of 1993, Rowling gave birth to a baby girl and named her Jessica, after one of her favorite writers, Jessica Mitford. She says it was this experience of motherhood that would ultimately push her to the point where she had to make a change.
I do remember thinking very clearly, and that was probably at the moment I knew I had to leave, about a month before I did leave. She's not going to grow up and watch this happening to her mother. She's not going to grow up and think that this is normal or okay.
So she started mapping out a way to get to her sister, who lived in Scotland.
I'd been planning a kind of orderly withdrawal. I've been trying to set things up so I get my daughter out, everything's smooth, everything is arranged. But then there came a night, I don't even know what triggered it. And this was probably about a week before I'd planned to make my exit. There came a night where he became very angry with me. And I cracked and I said, I want to go, I want to leave. And he became very violent. And he said, if you're leaving, you can leave, but you're not getting Jessica. I'm keeping her. I will hide her. So I put up a fight. And I paid the price. There was a very loud and a violent scene, which terminated with me lying in the street. And then I thought, right, I'm going to the police. And I went to the police. And I was assessed, and I was agreed that I clearly had just been beaten up. I was pretty bruised. And I filed a complaint. And the next day went back to the house with the police and got Jessica back.
Sitting where you are today is one of the most powerful, influential women in the world. Like, it almost seems like you're describing a different person. You know, you are a person without a key to your own flat, and you're being physically abused and beaten up and smuggling out, plotting an escape.
But the thing is, I am still that person, you see. Mm-hmm. To me, the through line is very clear.
Rolling and her daughter moved from Portugal to Edinburgh, Scotland. With just a couple of suitcases and next to nothing in her bank account, she was starting over, again.
When you moved back to the UK, what did your life look like?
Well, I'm not going to say it was as low as you can go, because it wasn't. I had very kind people who helped me. I could go stay with my sister, which was obviously not the case for some people who find themselves in my situation. And I think I spent 2-3 weeks with my sister, and then I moved into my own place, which was really a glorified bedsit.
Wait, a glorified what?
Bedsit. Do you not have that phrase?
What is that phrase?
I mean, it's like a room and a half. You know, so my first flat was like, there was a bathroom, but the kitchen, pretty much everything else is together.
Oh, okay. Like a studio apartment is.
Okay,
yeah,
but that sounds so much more glamorous than bedsit. And I call Jessica Decker, so Decker and I were sharing a bedroom.
Rolling said she was even more adrift than when she left the UK years before. She was divorced, broke, a single mother, and she had just enrolled in a teacher training program in hopes of eventually getting a job at a local school.
But I was living on benefits, which you would call welfare, obviously, and I was, at this point, my mental health was not good. I'd never lived in Scotland, although I have Scottish ancestry. I was really here because my sister was here.
She felt isolated. She was questioning her worth. She didn't have her mother there to help her become a mother. She says that she was losing herself.
I was dissociating. I was losing time. I was definitely had suicidal thoughts. I was in a very dark, shaky place.
And yet it was this darkness, getting this low, that she now is almost grateful for.
It stripped away the inessential. It showed me, even though I was a mess, candidly I was a mess, I had this daughter that I loved beyond anything in my life. It was love like as I'd never experienced before. And that was so powerful. And I do remember continuing to work on that story. I spent 17 years working on Potter. And there are things I understand in that story that no one else can possibly understand, and which I stayed true to, even as my own life improved and my own state of mind became healthier. I was still very committed to those parts that I'd plotted in darkness, as it were, because there was a truth to them and there was a power to them.
You must know who your mama and dad were, he said. I mean, they were famous. You're famous. What? Said Harry. My mum and dad were famous? Were they? You don't know? Hagrid ran his fingers through his hair, fixing Harry with a bewildered stare. You don't know who you are?
I could have no idea what was going to come.
This podcast is supported by Moinkbox. Before I moved to a tiny farming community nearly a decade ago, I didn't really have a sense of where my food came from or how it was raised. Now I do, because I subscribe to Moinkbox. Yes, that's Moo plus Oink. I know a lot of family farmers, and Moink is a meat subscription box company on a mission to fight for the family farm. Located in rural America and run by an 8th-generation female farmer, Moink meat is better than what's at your typical grocery. Moink delivers grass-fed and grass-finished beef and lamb, pastured pork and chicken, and sustainable wild-caught Alaskan salmon straight to your door. As a working mom with an infant, a preschooler, and a full-time job, I will do anything to save time, energy, and brain space. And Moink is a hack I'd recommend to anyone. Keep American farming going by signing up at moinkbox.com/witchtrials right now, and listeners of this show get free bacon in your first box. It's some of the best bacon you'll ever taste, but only for a limited time. Spelled MOINK box.com/witchtrials. That's moinkbox.com/witchtrials.
Hi, listeners. I'm Barry Weiss, and I'm the host of Honestly, a podcast where disagreement doesn't equal dislike, and where we value frank and at times blunt conversations about the biggest questions facing our society. What does a country with a Second Amendment actually do about gun violence? Is social media addiction behind the rise in self-harm among kids? Do we need to radically rethink our political system in an age of polarization? And why is America so fat? Whether I'm talking to documentarian Ken Burns about American democracy, or the head of OpenAI, Sam Altman, about how technology is reshaping the world, or humorist David Sedaris on how to laugh in the face of tragedy, we always strive to have the most sincere and, yes, honest conversations you will find anywhere. Join us by subscribing to Honestly on whatever podcast app you're using right now. And thanks.
A part of the folklore around Harry Potter, which turns out to be true, is that originally the first book was rejected by 12 different publishers before finally someone was willing to put it out.
Publishing wants to be with the zeitgeist, which is, a business decision. I think sometimes they make mistakes, and what they think is the zeitgeist is a very particular and narrow view of the zeitgeist, but that's another discussion.
The people who rejected it should be fired, obviously.
This is Charles, a.k.a. Chip.
My name is Chip McGrath. I'm the former editor of the New York Times Book Review.
Formerly the head of the biggest books department in publishing.
I'm going to say 1995 to 2004.
So this is right when Harry Potter blew up.
Yeah.
Nobody anticipated that it was going to do as well as it did.
And this is Kat.
So my name's Kat Rosenfield. I'm a culture writer and the author of 5 books, including 2 young adult novels.
Even after Rowling was finally able to get a publisher.
When it was first purchased, it was not anticipated to be a particularly big book.
They only printed 500 copies. The publishers, both the ones that rejected the book and the one that finally agreed to put it out, they just felt like it wasn't of the moment.
I think there were 3 things going on with the book. Firstly, boarding school, passé, no one's going to be interested. Secondly, it's too long. So the first one's 95,000 words, and I can't even remember how long Phoenix is, Order of the Phoenix, but little did they know what was coming. And then thirdly, I don't think it was necessarily, it might have been that he was a boy.
One of the issues was about gender. In particular, the fact that Rowling was a woman.
So then they want me to not use my first name. They want me to use my initials.
They were concerned that a woman's name on the front of the book would discourage boys from wanting to read it. And this has always been a concern in publishing. How do we get boys to read? And so this pen name, J.K. Rowling, was selected at the behest of the publishers.
Joanne Rowling doesn't even have a middle name. The famous J.K. was made up just for the books.
There was an understanding, I think, at this point that the novel was going to have limited appeal already. So this was a way of trying to attract more readers, choosing a gender-neutral name.
In 1997, the 500 copies of the book were distributed to bookstores and libraries.
The first time I saw the book in a bookshop. Now that to me was a bigger deal than I can express to you. I am a published writer. Look, there it is.
Do you remember where you first saw it in a shop?
I remember vividly. It's actually not there anymore. It was a Waterstones, a mainstream book outlet. And I genuinely didn't go in there to look for it. I went in there to buy a picture book for my daughter. And I turned and I looked at the R section of the, the chapter books. And I was, as I thought, it will be there, I saw it. It's a completely unknown book. There's no fanfare. There was no big launch party.
Mm-hmm.
That's normal.
It wasn't in the window.
No, of course not. It's just quietly appeared on the shelf. And it was one of the best moments of my life. It was the most incredible feeling. There was very little marketing budget, but it became clear fairly early on that children were telling children about the book.
It's like a chain reaction. Everybody gets involved with that. In my class, you didn't read Harry Potter? Yeah, 2 days later. It was so good, wasn't it?
It was word of mouth. It started to get bigger and bigger.
It's very different. It's not like a normal, average book. It's so imaginative. It's so detailed. It's almost like watching the book instead of reading it.
Quickly, those 500 copies they originally printed became 30,000 copies. And then, in less than a year, Scholastic Books, one of the biggest publishers in the U.S., picked up the book. And suddenly,
if you don't know it, your children almost certainly do.
It was everywhere.
A little boy named Harry Potter is working magic in the world of books.
Harry Potter is an old-fashioned, good triumphs over evil story, but full of quirks and surprises.
This idea of an orphan boy, abused, neglected, unwanted, who suddenly gets a mysterious letter telling him there's a whole other world out there with a place for him in it. This idea that in this other world, full of adventure and danger, giants and dragons, good and evil, he'll find his friends, his identity, his courage to do great things. This idea that Rowling came up with on the train in 1990, it just profoundly connected with so many people. And as its success grew, Rowling's own life started to become part of the story.
Joanne Rowling, a 34-year-old single mother and currently the world's most successful author, lives and writes in the shadow of Edinburgh Castle in Scotland.
I mean, she is the subject then of this sort of mythologizing.
And while she thought of herself as a writer, she had never published anything.
I mean, her story is, in a way, it's like a Harry Potter story itself. It's a kind of a fairy tale.
Jo Rowling's rise to success is this sort of feminist Cinderella story.
What makes Jo Rowling's success all the more remarkable is what it followed. She had few friends and fewer prospects and ended up on welfare, actually skipping meals to make sure she had enough money for her 4-month-old baby.
You have a single mom on welfare who writes this book that changes the course of the culture.
Her agent says that Rowling, barely 5 years away from welfare, could end up making $100 million.
This idea of a woman doing it on her own.
I was so ill-equipped for what happened to me. Now, I was grateful. I was hugely grateful that the work was loved. That part brought me nothing but joy. And materially speaking, I mean, my life had been transformed. At that point, I was living, for the first time, I'd been able to buy a house. But I was scared. What was happening to me in terms of fame was outstripping me constantly. So I buy this very ordinary house that's standing on a nice, ordinary street, and I've got journalists parked outside my front door. They're within feet of my front door.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
So, you know, I felt like I was playing catch-up all the time with the situation.
Right.
And I wasn't...
It was changing faster than you could respond to it.
It was changing far faster than I could deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And all the time, I have this lurking fear because I know that there's someone out there who does not wish me well. So, you know, that was strange. And then, well, to tell you the truth, the reason we left that first place was my ex-husband arrived and broke in.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So moving became quite a pressing issue at that point. And
in the middle of all of this, like, you're still worried. You have not escaped your husband.
You see, this is the insanity of it, okay? I'm trying to retain, you know, like an iron wall around my location as well, because everyone wants to come. Can I photograph you at home? No, you can't photograph me at home. Why not? You're being so precious. You're being so starry. And it's not that at all. It was quite the reverse. It's because the last time my ex-husband knew my address, he turned up and broke in.
What was that like? I mean, you're this rising star and you're still trying to hide.
I think that's actually the most accurate summary of my situation I've ever heard. You know, try and reconcile suddenly having a lot of press interest with really, really wanting to live under the radar for very concrete reasons. You know, not because I thought I was Salinger, not because, you know, I'm Greta Garbo, but because...
Your own safety.
Yeah. I was living in a state of real tension that I couldn't express to many people.
11, 10, 9, and yet, with the release of each new book, the Harry Potter phenomenon broke new records. There were midnight release parties where, all over the world, thousands of people lined up or camped out all night.
At midnight, less than 1 hour from now, the new Harry Potter book goes on sale here in Southern California. Potter fans in other cities like London,
where children actually slept outside bookstores overnight when the latest in the series was going on sale.
I mean, the thing about the Potter thing was it went on and on and on. I mean, it was a publishing whirlwind.
It's unprecedented in American children's books. It's unprecedented in English children's books. There's nothing that compares to the velocity of the success of Harry Potter. And it's not just kids. Adults are into Harry Potter, too.
Well, I started out buying them for my grandson, who's very young, and then I started reading them, and I liked them so well, I kept going.
You really feel you know this character.
It was increasingly difficult to describe how big it was.
This is really nothing that can be compared to a normal success.
People kept trying to kind of outdo themselves in terms of their superlative language.
The largest printing of a book ever, the fastest selling book ever.
It was somebody is picking up Harry Potter every 30 seconds.
The books are now in 26 languages and 140 countries.
The Potter books are available in 200 countries and translated into 46 languages.
It was really insane.
As we crossed over into the year 2000, suddenly everything seemed to just supersize itself. Everything, from my point of view, became a bit more crazy.
It all became so much that it started to seem like too much. J.K. Rowling had created an uncanny world, and the phenomenon that surrounded it was itself becoming uncanny.
I was signing for like 2,000 people at a time. You've got fights breaking out in the car park. You've got security there.
Just the enormity of it brought this tension.
There is something about a mass of human beings. There's always an edge in a crowd, always.
And in 2000, at a big crowded book signing,
we had a bomb threat at one store from allegedly a far-right Christian person.
It was clear by this time that there was a mounting backlash to Harry Potter.
As we approach the 21st century, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that our entire culture is in trouble. We're staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, and we can no longer afford to act like it's loaded with blanks.
And a movement was growing to stop Rowling and ban her books.
Things are getting a little bit nervy at this point, you know.
We're in a moral freefall when your children can be taught witchcraft by Harry Potter, that Heather has two mummies. You can let your daughter go to school and she can get an abortion without your permission or without your knowledge. Something is dreadfully wrong when you, as the parent, cannot control the destiny of your own child. America has turned its back on the God of the Bible, and it's time for the Church of Jesus Christ to stand up and speak up and say we have a right to the destiny of our own children.
The story continues in Chapter 2. You've been listening to The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, produced by Andy Mills, Matthew Bohl, and me, Megan Phelps-Roper, and brought to you by the Free Press. Our sincere thanks to you for listening, and we would love to listen to you too. If you have any questions or thoughts for us, you can send us an email over at witchtrials@thefp.com. Hello, dear listener. I'm Megan, host of this series, and before we get into the show, I wanted to take a minute to tell you about our sponsor, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We live in a moment when free speech, the bedrock of our democracy and of all free societies, is often viewed as suspect, where many argue that the right to free speech is too dangerous, and that even listening to ideological opponents is morally wrong. Many people just don't see a problem with using the law, corporate power, and even extraordinary social pressure to censor viewpoints they disagree with. But many of us feel the costs of all this in our everyday lives. We feel it when we self-censor, afraid to say what we really think, sometimes even in private conversations with friends or loved ones. We feel it when we opt out of a growing number of public discussions, afraid of the potential cost to our jobs and even our relationships. FIRE shares a mission with this show, to remind us why a culture of free speech and open dialogue matters, and regardless of how loud the calls for censorship are, FIRE's defense of that culture is unshakable and invaluable. And if you want to remember why we choose freedom, even for people we strenuously disagree with, you can learn more about FIRE's incredible work at thefire.org. And now, on to the show. How universal is the idea of the witch?
It's really a pan-cultural concept. It begins in the ancient world, when in fact witches were often men.
This is Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Stacy Schiff, author of The Witches, Salem, 1692. She says that witches are mentioned in several ancient scriptures, and that the first documented witch trial took place in ancient Greece. And from there, it spread
throughout the world.
Stacy says there were witch hunts across Europe.
Largely in Germany and France.
There were witch hunts in Switzerland, Russia, Turkey, Sweden.
It would be difficult to say who were the greatest of witch hunters.
There have been witch hunts by Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, animists.
There does seem to be something sort of archetypally general about this doer of supernatural deeds, somehow bound up with many religious constructs.
In all of these different societies, across time, all over the world, that engaged in this sort of behavior, is there anything you can point to that they all have in common? Or like, is there a set of circumstances or underlying characteristics about a society that make it more likely to succumb to a witch trial frenzy?
I think we tend to see that kind of fear when there's political dislocation of some kind. So much of witchcraft is about assigning blame and discharging one's anxiety, and political dislocation will make people feel that they are on edge and insecure and therefore more likely to point fingers.
Chapter 2. Burn the Witch. On New Year's Eve, 1990, J.K. Rowling learned that her mother, just 45 years old, had died after suffering for years from MS. She moved away, then suffered a miscarriage, and became trapped in an abusive marriage. She escaped, but found herself penniless and sank into a deep depression. And yet, by the end of that decade, she had become a mother, and eventually reached a level of success that no author had ever known. But what did that decade look like to the people who would become her censors, to those who would accuse her of being dangerous to children, and would lead to Harry Potter becoming one of the most banned books of the 21st century? Who were they? And what did all of this have to do with the 1990s? For me and many others who grew up with Harry Potter, it's easy for us to remember the 90s for what was seemingly so great about them.
Our economy is the healthiest it has been in 3 decades.
It was a time when poverty was going down and the economy was booming.
Now we move to an age of technology, information, and global competition.
We were awash in new technologies that many thought could unite the world.
How about a phone that fits in your pocket?
What do President Clinton, conservative radio personality Rush Limbaugh, and rock star Billy Idol have in common? They've all got electronic mail addresses on computer systems linked to the internet.
It seemed like nearly everybody was watching the same movies.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
And cheering for the same stars.
Jordan a drive, hangs, fires, scores! He scores!
The 90s are remembered by many as a time when politics weren't everywhere all the time, and where real social progress was made, especially around gay rights.
This is so hard, but I mean, what is wrong? Why do I have to be so ashamed? I mean, why can't I just say the truth? I'm gay.
Ellen DeGeneres comes out on network television. Rent is the biggest musical on Broadway. Will and Grace becomes a primetime hit. And President Clinton issues a declaration naming June Gay and Lesbian Pride Month.
Modernity is bursting out all over. And the biggest problem we've got is the primitive, age-old fear and hatred and dehumanization of the other, people who aren't like us.
After several cities in Colorado passed local laws protecting gays from discrimination, state voters in 1992 passed Constitutional Amendment 2, wiping those laws off the books and forbidding legal protection for homosexuals.
But, of course, things weren't really so unified, or as rosy as some remember.
It is not something that American society should condone and affirm in front of our children or in front of our society in general.
After Ellen came out on TV, there was a backlash where people tried to get her show canceled, and ultimately, it led ABC to put a parental advisory trigger warning at the start of each episode. There was a movement of people who believed passionately that there was a dangerous progressive agenda forcing gay rights on the country.
We need to stop the homosexual agenda, which is going to take over our town, our schools, everything if we don't put a stop to it. We'll keep fighting.
And if that sounds familiar, that's because so much of the language and the passion around the most divisive social issues still alive today have deep roots in the surprisingly similar political tensions of the 1990s.
No justice, no peace! No justice, no peace!
There were the LA riots.
It has exploded into a city out of control.
Where a video of white cops beating a black man ignited unrest that eventually led to the deaths of 63 people, more than twice the number who died during the riots in the summer of 2020.
I feel that there is an undercurrent of racism and that the system is rotten to the core.
And it was one of the only other times in history that America impeached a president.
Today, drawn and bleary-eyed, Mr. Clinton joined the battle to save his presidency.
And it was a president who many saw as deeply immoral.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
That's why I fucked your bitch, you fat motherfucker. West Side.
Much of the youth culture that thrived in the 90s was intentionally transgressive. Provocatively violent music, like gangsta rap, went mainstream. There was the anti-conformity of grunge. And eventually, the boom of a goth subculture.
They wear white makeup, dress up in black, and look like the living dead. But they're not real-life vampires stalking the night. They're just part of the Gothic movement.
Which some saw as just kids playing around with identity and being rebellious as kids do.
This is Dan and his 18-year-old daughter, Sunny. She's been dressing and looking like this since she was 12. She has pierced her ear, her own eyebrow, and plans to pierce her lip, nose, and tongue.
But others worried was actually glorifying death.
I find society to be really bleak right now. I'd rather be dead than conform with it.
The very foundations of our society are in danger of being burned. The flames of hedonism, the flames of narcissism, the flames of self-centered morality are licking at the very foundations of our society.
There was a growing concern among many adults back then, just as there is today, that the cultural forces influencing young people were leading them to be depressed, anxious, and antisocial. And in response to this, they saw a subset of the country saying that what these young people needed was medical intervention.
Ritalin is being increasingly prescribed for hyperactive and disruptive children.
3 years ago, Prozac hit the market in a whirlwind of publicity and praise. Today, more than 3.5 million patients worldwide are treated with...
Which sparked a national debate about whether to trust big pharmaceutical companies and the doctors who were telling parents that their kids needed these drugs.
Why are the drug companies marketing so feverishly to children now? Because it's not just the children's market. It's a lifetime patient.
The 90s saw the increasing influence of a disruptive form of media, the 24-hour news cycle.
Show the people on the bridges, Jeff.
Reporters on camera, in real time, speculating about what's happening on the ground.
The siege began Sunday morning when ATF agents went to the Branch Davidian compound near Waco to arrest cult leader David Koresh.
And what they were often capturing...
Cult leader David Koresh apparently remains holed up in his heavily armed fortress, and we assume that negotiations
were sensational and frightening tragedies, many of them involving the death of children.
That at least 7 bodies were in the compound, victims from Sunday's shootout. Federal agents have confirmed there are more dead inside the compound.
In the siege at Waco, Texas, 76 people were killed, including 25 children.
A massive car bomb exploded outside of a large federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, killing children, killing federal employees, military men, and...
The Oklahoma City bombing killed 168 people, including 19 children.
Bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens.
And then, most notoriously, there was Columbine.
Jefferson County 911. Yes, I am a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun. The student's down under the table, kids! Hands under the table!
Columbine wasn't the first school shooting, but largely because it was televised, it's seen as the school shooting that brought the issue front and center in America's consciousness, where it has remained ever since.
People were getting shot all around me. There was a guy at a table right next to us, next to me and her, and they just shot him and then walked away, and then he was just sitting there in a pool of blood.
35 students were shot. 14 of them died, and their bodies were brought out of the school on live television.
Amid the gunshots and bomb blasts, hundreds of students ran for their lives.
The 2 killers belonged to a group of students that named itself the Trenchcoat Mafia, and we are beginning to learn more about these teenagers.
And the massive coverage from the 24-hour news cycle?
The suspects were reportedly into the music of goth rocker Marilyn Manson, who has described himself as a satanic priest and an outsider.
Quickly formed a narrative, even before an investigation could be done.
Several school districts in the Denver area are banning students from wearing goth-like trench coats, and kids told us that police are rounding up some gothic teens. This young man's friend was brought in for questioning.
One of my friends gets arrested off the street for wearing a black trench coat, walking down the street for doing nothing wrong.
The speculation fueled fears about the influence of youth culture. It even came out that the 2 killers were on antidepressants.
If Marilyn Manson can walk into our town and promote hate, violence, suicide, death, drug use, and Columbine-like behavior, I can say, not without a fight you can't.
We now know, and it's worth mentioning, that much of that story told by the media in the aftermath of the shooting was wrong. The 2 killers were not part of a goth gang. They weren't big fans of Marilyn Manson. They weren't bullied by jocks. And in fact, one of them had been an athlete himself. But the story that was told resonated so deeply with the larger fears and anxieties of the 90s that it stuck.
When the Columbine school shooting happened, it served as confirmation.
This is Jared Stacy, who was a teenager back in the 90s, growing up in a community that, more than almost any other, feared the changes they were seeing in American society. Evangelical, fundamentalist Christians.
One of the features of the fundamentalism that I grew up in was this constant assumption of persecution.
Many versions of Christian fundamentalism had thrived in America throughout the 20th century. So much so that by the start of the 1990s, Jerry Falwell, founder of the Moral Majority movement, had declared, "Our goal has been achieved. The religious right is solidly in place, and religious conservatives in America are now in for the duration." But by the end of the decade and the Columbine massacre in 1999, many Christians were changing how they saw themselves and their standing in the culture.
The world was going to get worse and that persecution for Christians would come. And Columbine was huge. The way that Columbine was presented to us was that it was perpetrated by young men who were antagonistic towards Christians.
Well, they knew her and they knew that she was a Christian, and they created a target list.
There were certain things that those boys wanted to accomplish.
In addition to the reports about the Columbine killers being in a goth gang, many Christians heard an additional story. Churches across America were told that some students at Columbine had specifically been targeted for their faith. The killers allegedly walked up to these students, asked if they were Christians, and when the answer was yes, they executed them.
When that young man asked Cassie if she believed in God, she boldly said yes.
One of these stories turned into the best-selling book, She Said Yes.
We looked at each other and we said, would I have done that? I might have begged for my life. But she didn't. She may have been 17, but she's probably a better woman than I will ever be.
Interviews with the victims' parents were passed around churches and youth groups.
This confirms and justifies the paranoia that we have, that we are under attack.
Now, just like the broader media stories surrounding Columbine, She Said Yes and these stories of martyrs also turned out to be unfounded. But at the time, it helped inspire this belief among evangelical Christians, who already felt like the culture was turning against them, that now they were in real physical danger.
As we approach the 21st century, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that our entire culture is in trouble.
Columbine, in some ways, kind of proved that it was possible that you could walk out of your house and have a gun to your head and be asked, are you a Christian or not?
We're staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, and we can no longer afford to act like it's loaded with blanks.
There was Columbine, and I remember Harry Potter.
One of the bullets in this gun is the bullet of fantasy, which is just dominating our culture. Just dominating. By the way, that's a sign of nihilism. That's a sign of abandoning everything.
We're in a moral freefall. When your children can be taught witchcraft by Harry Potter, that Heather has two mummies, you can let your daughter go to school and she can get an abortion without your permission or without your knowledge. Something is dreadfully wrong when you, as the parent, cannot control the destiny of your own child. America has turned its back on the God of the Bible, and it's time for the Church of Jesus Christ to stand up and speak up and say we have a right to the destiny of our own children.
I think my publishers were definitely on the alert for trouble.
We'll be right back. This podcast is supported by Moinkbox. Before I moved to a tiny farming community nearly a decade ago, I didn't really have a sense of where my food came from or how it was raised. Now I do, because I subscribe to Moinkbox. Yes, that's Moo plus Oink. I know a lot of family farmers, and Moink is a meat subscription box company on a mission to fight for the family farm. Located in rural America and run by an 8th-generation female farmer, Moink meat is better than what's at your typical grocery. Moink delivers grass-fed and grass-finished beef and lamb, pastured pork and chicken, and sustainable wild-caught Alaskan salmon straight to your door. As a working mom with an infant, a preschooler, and a full-time job, I will do anything to save time, energy, and brain space. And Moink is a hack I'd recommend to anyone. Keep American farming going by signing up at moinkbox.com/witchtrials right now, and listeners of this show get free bacon in your first box. It's some of the best bacon you'll ever taste, but only for a limited time. Spelled MOINK box.com/witchtrials. That's moinkbox.com/witchtrials.
Hi, listeners. I'm Barry Weiss, and I'm the host of Honestly, a podcast where disagreement doesn't equal dislike, and where we value frank and at times blunt conversations about the biggest questions facing our society. What does a country with a Second Amendment actually do about gun violence? Is social media addiction behind the rise in self-harm among kids? Do we need to radically rethink our political system in an age of polarization? And why is America so fat? Whether I'm talking to documentarian Ken Burns about American democracy, or the head of OpenAI, Sam Altman, about how technology is reshaping the world, or humorist David Sedaris on how to laugh in the face of tragedy, we always strive to have the most sincere and, yes, honest conversations you will find anywhere. Join us by subscribing to Honestly on whatever podcast app you're using right now. And thanks.
Under the category of children's fantasy literature, sales of Harry Potter books have received phenomenal acceptance worldwide, breaking all records in children's literature. Through Harry Potter books and audios, children as young as kindergarten age are being introduced to human sacrifice, the sucking of blood from dead animals, and possession by spirit beings. The question is, should parents be concerned that the alluring power behind witchcraft is being made to look innocent and is being targeted towards their children through the Harry Potter phenomenon?
In the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, in what has become a largely forgotten chapter in the Harry Potter legacy, a passionate and motivated group of American Christians did everything they could to stop the popularity and ubiquity of Harry Potter.
Witchcraft is sin, right next to drunkenness, drugs, homosexuality, adultery.
At first, it was just a fringe.
Do you remember when you first understood that, people were calling your writing dangerous?
So I think it was in about 1999 that I first became aware that, the books were being banned.
Author J.K. Rowling.
That there was a vocal pushback against these books as dangerous and immoral.
But quickly, the movement spread to the airwaves of Christian radio.
God hates this. He really hates it. It's darkness, and he is light. It is evil.
Wicked, extreme words were being used, that I was harming children, that these books were poison for children's minds.
Then to popular Christian televangelists like John Hagee.
When you reject the truth, all that's left is a lie. When you reject love, all that's left is hate. When you read books about witchcraft, throw Harry Potter in that. You're opening the gates of your mind to the Prince of Darkness, and he will invade. And once he gets invited in, he doesn't go out until he's cast out.
And the backlash, it kept growing.
As we crossed over into the year 2000, suddenly everything seemed to just supersize itself. Everything, from my point of view, became a bit more crazy. I was signing for 2,000 people at a time. And we had a bomb threat at one store, allegedly from a far-right Christian person.
Although no bomb was ever found on the premises, it was enough to frighten Rowling and her team, especially because it was around this time that the fight against Harry Potter was ramping up at school board meetings across America.
The book's U.S. publisher is the highly respected Scholastic Books, which encourages teachers to read the books out loud to their students. Parent Elizabeth Mounts objects because she finds the books dark and disturbing.
There were book ban battles at school board meetings in Virginia, Texas, New Mexico, California, Arkansas.
Our child came home, it was being read in his class, and the concern we had with these books was the violent tones in here. There's evil, there's death, there's lack of respect for human life, and there's the occult.
And then there was James Dobson, the head of the most influential Christian organization in the country, Focus on the Family.
If you don't introduce your kids to a meaningful relationship with Jesus Christ, then you will never see your kids again in the afterlife. As far as I'm concerned, this is job one for parents.
He joined the calls to boycott Potter, which led to even more American parents forbidding their kids to read the books.
The Harry Potter books are mainstreaming witchcraft to our children. They're presenting it in a child-friendly format. that's dangerous and deceptive.
By the early 2000s, this group of Christians, even though they felt they were persecuted and increasingly saw themselves as culturally marginalized, we now know, thanks to a memoir by White House speechwriter Matt Latimer, that people who opposed Rolling's work were in the White House.
We believe that the Almighty hears our prayers and answers those who seek Him.
According to Latimer, members of George W. Bush's own administration objected to giving J.K. Rowling the Presidential Medal of Freedom because the books encouraged witchcraft. And Rowling? She says she wasn't exactly surprised by the backlash.
The experience in America was, not for the first time, very different from the experience in the UK. I remember speaking to my American editor about it, and he was pretty robust about it. You know, he felt, it's not true, these are very moral books. I remember saying to him, this was inevitable. And by that I meant, it's got too big. It's just got too big. You know, there are plenty of other books about witches and wizards out there. But I think a lot of the pushback was the sheer scale of it. People were alarmed by the scale of it.
To start, can you tell me your name and whatever title you'd like us to use?
Yeah, sure. My name is David Hogue, D-A-V-I-D-H-O-G-U-E. I'm trained to do that in court, sorry. And I'm a lawyer. I've been practicing since 1994, I think. And when the Harry Potter case came up in Cedarville, Arkansas, actually I reached out to the school district and offered my assistance.
David Hogue is a Christian parent and lawyer. He represented an Arkansas school district in a Harry Potter book ban case in 2002 that set precedent for many school libraries still today.
Basically what happened in Cedarville was the librarian, she got the books and put them in the library for kids to get and read because it was popular then, and it did get, I mean, kids were reading 300-page books, which was crazy. Mm-hmm. So she put them in the library, and then I think it was Angie Haney who was the parent who found out about that and wanted them taken out of the library altogether, or at least just put behind the desk so parents would have to approve. And that's where it all started.
So does the hubbub over Harry Potter seem outlandish, or do parents have a real argument here?
There was people on both sides at the school board meetings.
I think it's just fantasy. It's a book. It's not reality, and I think children can make the difference. They can draw the line.
Some parents were saying these books are good for the kids because it promotes literacy, and some parents were saying this is horrible for the kids because it promotes witchcraft.
The thing that we found, my wife and I found objectionable, was it was being read aloud to our son in his class. And in this post-Columbine era that we're living in, we felt like with kids living out their fantasies, this book may have potential for that.
To say the least, it was tense.
And how urgent was this for them?
Oh, it's ridiculously urgent because the books were everywhere and they were written for kids. And a lot of parents were afraid that a child will read, you know, a couple of the first pages and get hooked in and, you know, hide it under their bed and keep reading and be sucked into something they shouldn't be.
This is from book 1. See what I have become, the face said, mere shadow and vapor. I have form only when I can share another's body. Unicorn blood has strengthened me these past weeks. Yikes, unicorn blood?
When was the first time you heard of Harry Potter? Do you remember?
Honestly, the first time I heard of Harry Potter was when the books first started coming out. At first, when people would tell me, you know, there's these Harry Potter books and it's about a kid that's a witch and it's kind of naturally in him that he's a witch, and then he learns the skills of a witch and so forth, and he goes to a witch school or a witch or wizardry school. At first, I took it seriously, like a lot of people do, because based on my own Baptist Christian raising and my study of witchcraft and sorcery and demonology and so forth.
David actually told me that in college he'd taken classes trying to better understand things like exorcism and some of the older practices in the Christian faith.
And I found some things that matched sort of the real life stuff that I'd read about.
So Christianity, in its essence, is a religion based on unearned grace and sacrifice. The foundational claim of many Christians is that God created all people and loved them so much that he sent his own Son to rescue them, both from their own evil nature and from all the darkness, pain, and injustice that fills this world and makes life so hard.
In spite of our rebellion, in spite of our disobedience, in spite of our sins, God loves us. That's the thrilling thing about it. And God loves every person in the whole world.
And in turn, Christians are commanded to love all people and to fight against that darkness and injustice. But many fundamentalists believe that the same Bible that teaches them to love also teaches them to take an active role in shaping the morality of the broader culture by challenging what they see as antithetical to Christian morals. That Bible demands that they engage in a cosmic war between good and evil, and that they must be on guard constantly, because evil is lurking everywhere.
We should love the things that God loves and hate the things that God hates. God hates divination, sorcery, and witchcraft, and we should too.
And witchcraft is a part of that evil.
Witchcraft teaches that there's only one power, it's neutral. The Bible says there's two powers, the power of God and the power of the devil, and this verse says that we are in a battle between these two powers. And it's an intense battle, and it's going on right now. There's another verse in Revelation 9 I want to share with you.
There are more than a dozen specific references to the evils of witchcraft in the Bible, and one of the clearest is found in Leviticus. A man also or a woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a witch, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. Or in Exodus, the simple, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. But there are also many other verses that warn about the evils of things associated with witchcraft, like divination, the seeking of unknown or future things by supernatural forces. And J.K. Rowling made divination one of the classes in the fictional wizard school that Harry attends.
Deuteronomy 18 says, anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens or a sorcerer or a charmer or or a medium or a necromancer or one who inquires of the dead. That's a pretty big list.
And the central fear of these Christians isn't really that their kids are going to start predicting the future or casting spells. It's that these evil forces will literally harm their children.
I believe that some of that is real, and it concerned me that some of the things in Harry Potter, which were put in a fiction book, were actually taken from reality.
Like divination?
Yes. In my opinion, at first, having not read the books, it touched it a little bit too realistically, and it touched it a little bit too much for my taste.
And maybe it sounds absurd to be talking about witchcraft invading kids' minds in modern America. But actually, it was something talked about, not just in Christian circles, but in the culture more broadly, even on mainstream news.
It's hard to know the exact numbers, but Wicca is believed to be one of the fastest growing religions among high school and college students. This form of witchcraft, with its reverence for the earth and nature, appeals to young environmentalists, and Wicca's emphasis on a goddess as well as a god draws young girls. Today, the final.
This is audio from an NPR news feature that aired on All Things Considered in the early 2000s.
There's an increasing willingness to say, well, what I believe is true, but I believe that other individuals have access to the truth as well. In fact, I think I can have my beliefs and add on to them some beliefs of my neighbor.
And that in part explains the wild popularity of Wicca or witchcraft among young people.
Change us, touch us and change us.
Wicca, with its mystical ceremonies, its goddess worship, its reverence for nature, offers no specific doctrine, Followers can stitch together a personal religion with, say, Native American prayer and Hindu meditation. What counts is that it's yours, not a...
The reporter even discusses the connection between pop culture and teenage interest in witchcraft.
She began noticing the surge in teen interest with the release of a certain film in 1996, when witchcraft became young and glamorous.
Guardian of the bitter sea, show us your glory. Show us your power.
The Craft, a little-known movie among adults, was a hit among teenage girls and changed the way they thought about witches.
And even though that connection is depicted as harmless in the story, it was exactly what many Christians advocating for boycotts were afraid of.
Hollywood is glorifying witchcraft.
Whether on TV,
one of the biggest ones here is Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Charmed series,
or in the movies.
Practical Magic, The Witches of Eastwick, The Craft. These programs and these movies have been watched by kids and young adults and adults over and over and over and over again. And of course, then there's probably the biggest of them all, and that is Harry Potter.
It got to the point where Rowling, in interviews, felt the need to say clearly that she didn't actually believe in magic.
There are two groups of people who think I am wholeheartedly with them. One are people who believe passionately in the boarding school system, and the other group are practicing witches. I have to say I'm not on either of their sides.
That she wasn't trying to spread witchcraft at all.
I don't believe in magic in that sense.
But some, like Christian film producer Carol Matriciana, pushed back, essentially saying, it doesn't matter what you say. We can see that you do, in fact, support witchcraft.
Many have argued that Joanne Rowling is not teaching the children witchcraft and the books are not about witchcraft. The lie about this is a true representation of witchcraft and the black arts and black magic.
Christian televangelist John Hagee even wondered if she was a secret Nazi.
Even Harry Potter's forehead is marked with the lightning bolt of the Hitler SS.
And so, the calls for book bans continued.
The school board initially put the books behind the librarian's desk and required a parent's permission slip for any child to check out those books, or even just to get them and read them in the library.
Again, attorney David Hogue, who represented the Cedarville School Board.
The school board said, kind of, it's better to be safe than sorry. We don't want to expose the kids to things that the parents are vehemently opposed to and the parents say are dangerous for the kids. And so they thought that the best compromise position would be, okay, the books are still available, but you have to have parental permission to get to the books.
It's Brian.
This call is being recorded.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for talking with me.
You're welcome.
And this is Brian Metters.
My name is Brian Metters. I used to be a trial lawyer in Arkansas, and a large part of my practice was handling civil rights cases.
He was the attorney arguing on behalf of the parents who wanted Potter to be freely available in Cedarville school libraries. He's retired now, but agreed to take my call from his home in Memphis, Tennessee.
Can you tell me what your side in this case was arguing?
My clients had a First Amendment right to access information. And this case focused on the issue of how much control, if any, a school board can exercise on the content that is already in the school library. Can they restrict certain viewpoints because they don't personally like them or they find that it goes against their religion? Or is a school library an open forum and age-appropriate material can be freely distributed? We believe that it was the latter. The school library is an open forum. It is there for intellectually curious children, and material that is already in the library that is age-appropriate should be freely available without any restriction based on the material's viewpoint.
And ultimately, Brian's side won the case.
The court agreed with us because we had very good precedent on our side. The three school board members, they all admitted under oath that the reason they restricted those books was because they didn't agree with the religious viewpoint. They deemed the books to be inconsistent with their version of Christianity, and therefore they thought that they were doing the right thing by removing them or restricting access to the books. Nobody was able to cite any kind of disruption that the books caused. At that point, that's a pretty solid case.
Here's how David Hogue explains it.
The judge at that time ruled in favor of Brian's case that the right to freedom of information would, in this case, overrule the right to parents having a say in their children's education. Even a minor child has that right to freedom of information that can't be abridged by the school and the parents' concerns about what may be in that information.
So ultimately, do you think the courts were right in how they ruled, even though it meant that you lost the case?
Oh yeah, some cases need to be lost.
One strange thing about this story is that, in talking to David, I learned that he had completely changed his mind about this case that he'd argued so strongly long ago.
If Christians get all caught up in banning books that we think are dangerous for our kids, then we're legally opening the door to non-Christians banning books for their kids that we think are good for their kids.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to Brian and David is because of the many recent book bans taking place across America right now.
Well, we want to turn now to the sharp rise in book bans in America's schools and libraries. A recent study found hundreds of books, mostly focused on LGBTQ themes or racial issues, have now been forbidden across the country.
Banning books over their subject matter. The Hillsdale Library Board is looking at purging the shelves of LGBTQ topics.
And how these Harry Potter book ban cases from years ago are still having an effect on our culture today.
The battle is over these 5 books with LGBTQ themes.
These books and lifestyle choices are destructive and wrong.
Would you say that these cases involving Harry Potter-related book bans and restrictions are now the kind of precedent that is protecting LGBTQ books in public libraries?
Yes, I think that's fair. The part of the legacy of Harry Potter is that it's going to protect a lot of the LGBTQ books. That's right. Things like this are going to always happen, and they always have in American history, right? There's always going to be some group that considers itself aggrieved. They're going to try to shut down viewpoints that they don't like. You know, I think a good example of this might be Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn has been attacked at different times from both the right and the left. Decades ago, the right attacked it because they didn't approve of the race mixing in the book. And now left-wing groups attack it because they believe that it portrays African Americans in a disfavorable light. These things are always happening. They're kind of like dandelions in your yard. I don't know if you can ever really get rid of them, but you can just try to reduce the number.
What did you think of David Hogue, who argued the case on the other side?
I like David Hogue. David Hogue is one of many opposing counsel who later became a friend of mine. At that time in our lives, David and I saw the world very differently. But I liked him and I respect him.
And David Hogue, for his part, eventually read the Harry Potter series in its entirety and changed his mind about it too.
They are good books. I think they do get a bit dark, but I don't see harm in those books. And if you have contact with J.K. Rowling, please thank her for the joy that those books are.
So looking back, would you say that the Christian parents were maybe part of a moral panic, specifically around those books?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a scary world out there. And I remember back then that it seemed like the world was just getting to be a more and more scary place. Once you start seeing, the 24-hour news cycle, CNN break off this direction and Fox News break off this direction, the internet was just coming in. And I think people were starting to have a little bit of fear of what all was out there.
When you would see these people burning your books, literally burning them, and trying to get them banned and removed from schools and libraries. How did you understand what was going on inside of them?
Well, I think that this is something I explore in the Potter books. A sense of righteousness is not incompatible with doing terrible things. Most of the people in movements that we consider hugely abhorrent, many of the people involved in those movements understood themselves to be on the side of righteousness, believed they were doing the right thing, felt themselves justified in what they were doing. I suppose for me, book burners by definition, predictably, to me have placed themselves across a line of rational debate. I'm simply going to destroy the idea that I don't like. I will destroy the idea. I can't destroy it, so I will destroy its representation. I will burn this book. There is no book on this planet that I would burn. No book, including books that I do think are damaging.
Mm-hmm.
Burning, to me, is the last resort of people who cannot argue.
One theme that really jumps out right at the start of the books is how people like Harry's aunt and uncle keep saying to him, don't ask questions. And I just wonder, what's the significance of having this whole 7-book journey start with that theme?
Well, there you are, you see. We've just returned immediately to the book burners. They are completely certain that they are doing the right thing, and that justifies cruelty, unmerited punishment, telling him he's things he's not. Mm-hmm. He's bad, he's wrong, and hiding information. And the don't ask questions and the burning of the letters, there you are, you have it right at the start. Mm-hmm. You are not allowed to look beyond what we say is normal, what we say is the world.
There are plenty of stories, especially children's stories, where the heroes are the heroes and the villains are the villains. Mm-hmm. And the only real question in the stories is whether the heroes can defeat the villains. But that's not the Harry Potter story at all. The heroes are flawed. Mm-hmm. Some people we think of as villains turn out to be the ones who save the day. And, so many characters that we at first glance think are bad or scary are actually just misunderstood. And one of the early themes of the books is that if you want to figure out the truth, you shouldn't jump to conclusions, that your prejudices can betray you, and that your first judgment might not be accurate. You really seem to have this deep awareness of this type of human behavior that, the temptation to fall into this very simplistic black and white kind of morality. But there is also a clear presence in the books of the reality that there is such a thing as good and that there is such a thing as evil. And even though it's not always easy to tell, you ultimately have to.
Yeah.
Right? How do you discern when a behavior falls on one side of that line or the other?
I mean, that's such a deep question, and it goes to the heart of Potter, and it goes to the heart of much of my worldview. The irredeemably evil character in Potter has dehumanized himself. So Voldemort has consciously and deliberately made himself less than human. And we see the natural conclusion of what he's done to himself through very powerful magic. What he's left with is something less than human. And he's done that deliberately. He sees humane behavior as weakness. He has reduced himself to something that cannot feel the full range of human emotion. There's a huge appeal, and I try to show this in the Potter books, to black and white thinking. It's the easiest place to be, and in many ways is the safest place to be. If you take an all or nothing position on anything, you will definitely find comrades. You will easily find a community. I've sworn allegiance to this one simple idea. What I tried to show in the Potter books, and what I feel very strongly myself, we should mistrust ourselves most when we are certain. And we should question ourselves most when we receive a rush of adrenaline by doing or saying something. Many people mistake that rush of adrenaline for the voice of conscience. I've got a rush from saying that, I'm right. Mm-hmm. In my worldview, conscience speaks in a very small and inconvenient voice, And it's normally saying to you, think again, look more deeply, consider this. And I was struck early on, actually, in the Potter phenomenon, by how the two characters that caused the most furious debate, and I'm actually using the word furious quite literally there at times, were Dumbledore and Snape. People wanted Dumbledore to be perfect. He's deeply flawed. But he is to me, he is an exemplar of goodness. He did wrong. He learned. He grew wise. But he has to make the difficult decisions that people in the real world have to make. Very difficult decisions. Meanwhile, you have Snape. Incontrovertibly a bully. He can be mean. He can be sadistic. He's bitter, but he is courageous. He is determined to make good what he did terribly wrong. And without him, disaster would have occurred. And I have had fans really angry at me for not categorizing Snape in particular, just wanting clarity and simplicity. Let's just agree this is a really bad guy. And I'm thinking, well, I can't agree with you because I know him, but also I can't agree with you full stop because people can be deeply flawed, people can make mistakes, people can do bad things. In fact, show me the human being who hasn't. And they can also be capable of greatness. And I mean greatness in a moral sense, not in a fame or an achievement sense.
So let me talk about the infamous book burning video for a second. I am not just offended by what J.K. Rowling says. I am fearful because of what she is promoting on her platform.
J.K. Rowling is literally putting trans lives at further risk. She just is. It's disgusting and it's problematic. I mean, let's face it, Hermione would punch this woman in the face right now.
Harry Potter franchise is literally making this world unsafe for kids today.
More to come next time. You've been listening to The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, produced by Andy Mills, Matthew Bull, and me, Megan Phelps-Roper, and brought to you by the Free Press. Our sincere thanks to you for listening, and we would love to listen to you too. If you have any thoughts or questions for us, you can send us an email at witchtrials@thefp.com. Hello, dear listener. I'm Megan, host of this series, and before we get into the show, I wanted to take a minute to tell you about our sponsor, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We live in a moment when free speech, the bedrock of our democracy and of all free societies, is often viewed as suspect, where many argue that the right to free speech is too dangerous, and that even listening to ideological opponents is morally wrong. Many people just don't see a problem with using the law, corporate power, and even extraordinary social pressure to censor viewpoints they disagree with. But many of us feel the costs of all this in our everyday lives. We feel it when we self-censor, afraid to say what we really think, sometimes even in private conversations with friends or loved ones. We feel it when we opt out of a growing number of public discussions, afraid of the potential cost to our jobs and even our relationships. Fire shares a mission with this show, to remind us why a culture of free speech and open dialogue matters. And regardless of how loud the calls for censorship are, Fire's defense of that culture is unshakable and invaluable. And if you want to remember why we choose freedom, even for people we strenuously disagree with, you can learn more about Fire's incredible work at thefire.org. And now, on to the show. This episode contains language that might not be suitable for children. Can you talk to me about some of the threats that you've received over the past few years?
There have been a lot. A huge amount, as every woman will know who speaks up on this issue, a huge amount of, I want her to choke on my fat trans dick. You know, like very sexualized abuse. Well, I don't think all of them mean it literally, but attempts to degrade, to humiliate. People might say, well, that's not really a threat. And you know what? Up to a point, you're probably right, though it's very unpleasant to be on the receiving end of it, particularly in the quantities I've had it. Then I have had direct threats of violence. And I have had people coming to my house where my kids live, and I've had my address posted online. I've had what the police anyway would regard as credible threats, yeah. The pushback is often, you are wealthy, you can afford security, you haven't been silenced. All true, right? All of that's true. But I think that misses the point. The attempt to intimidate and silence me is meant to serve as a warning to other women. And I say that because I have seen it used that way. I have seen other women, and other women have told me. I literally had someone say this to me the other day. I was told, look what happened to J.K. Rowling. Watch yourself.
Chapter 3. A New Pyre.
I didn't have internet at all when Philosopher's Stone came out. So around about 98, I did have internet, but would use it to look stuff up, like most of us do, and I would use it for email. But I have I think some sort of unconscious spirit of self-preservation had stopped me going and looking at Harry Potter, till the point where the internet fandom cropped up in interviews, and I thought, well, I need to know about this because I can't be ignorant about this. I need to know. Well, I mean, I went online for the first time, and I just had no idea. I just fell into this universe.
How deep into the fandom are you?
Very.
How many times do you think you've read the books?
10 to 15 times through the series.
The magic came from the first book, and there was just no turning back.
I'm Megan Phelps Roper, and we begin today in Orlando, Florida, at LeakyCon. LeakyCon is one of dozens of Harry Potter conventions that are held around the world every year.
Okay, so we are at LeakyCon 2022, and it is pretty packed.
I've been a fan since, I think, 1998, so I really grew up with Harry Potter.
And like many of these events, it takes place in a convention hall filled with a bunch of people who are dressed up as characters from the books.
So I'm dressed up as Buckbeak today, and I'm here with my husband, who's Sirius Black.
And then we have our witch hats and our wands.
I have my own prescription Harry Potter round glasses.
They sell handmade merchandise, they have meetups, and they even get tattoos.
This is just like my first childhood memory.
And how many Harry Potter tattoos do you think you've done?
Way too many to count.
And when you ask them, A lot of these fans are quick to say that it wasn't just Harry Potter that brought them together. It was the community they found surrounding it.
A lot of the community here at LeakyCon, they were my friends growing up. We were all online.
Specifically, on the internet.
I think Harry Potter is so special because it was coming out right when everyone was getting online.
Harry Potter, which would go on to become the best-selling book series of all time, just happened to be published right as many people were getting their first introduction to the internet. And so there is a generation of people who grew up alongside both the characters in the books and the ever-expanding power and influence of this new technology.
Pretty much as soon as I got on the internet, somehow, at age 12, I must have Googled Harry Potter.
In fact, for many fans, Harry Potter was their gateway to the internet. It was the first thing they ever looked up on Yahoo or Google. It was their first email address.
We were able to talk to people from around the world and meet people that have the same interests as us.
It was their first time talking to another person online. The first time they made a screen name.
I was going to MuggleNet.com every day to get the updates, talking on message boards, writing fan fiction on fanfiction.net. And it was such a special experience to get to connect with so many people who you didn't know necessarily, but who felt the same passion for Harry Potter.
One of the things that's I think you have to understand about Harry Potter is it is one of the biggest fan experiences that modern culture has to offer.
This is Helen Lewis, staff writer at The Atlantic, where she writes and reports about politics and internet culture.
At its peak, there were people writing hundreds of thousands of Harry Potter fan fiction stories. So taking the characters from Harry Potter and writing your own stories for them.
I was equally fascinated and alarmed, if I'm honest.
Rowling says that when she saw the way her books were colliding with the still quite new internet, much like her reaction to the book's surprise success, she was taken aback, but also really intrigued. What connections did you see people specifically, making with the books?
Well, there was the really sweet sorting of yourself into houses, which I think speaks deeply to children and also to adolescents.
Are you wearing yellow because you identify as a Hufflepuff?
Yes, 100%.
There was obviously the championing of different romantic combinations, which was very sweet.
Why Hermione and Draco?
Because who did not want the bad boy?
We can change him.
Yeah, that was everybody's fantasy, right?
Little groups of mutual support were made. Real friendships were made.
If you ever want to feel good about the world, go search the internet for friendships forged by Harry Potter. There are so many places where fans are just gushing. Like one user says, "My best friends in high school were a group of people I met because we loved talking about Harry Potter online. I'm so happy that I'm alive at the same time as the internet."
I watched it happening. I could see really beautiful interactions happening online. And, in later years, I met my best friend on MuggleNet. My husband and I connected over Harry Potter.
We are wearing our matching shirts from when we got engaged, and we had a complete Harry Potter wedding where we wore house robes instead of tuxes.
That's happened time and time again. And it's just a beautiful thing. So huge positives came out of that.
The biggest of the early fan websites was called MuggleNet. It was set up in 1999 by a 12-year-old homeschool kid in Indiana who could have had no idea how much this site was going to change his life. And that's partly because Rowling eventually embraced it. She was one of the first authors, the first creators of any kind, really, to invest time and energy communicating directly with her fans online, doing interviews, answering fan questions, really catering to the community she saw forming there. But she also told me that, on at least one occasion, she went into one of these forums anonymously.
So I chose a random name that was not a Potter-related name. I was almost scared, even though they've all got Potter-related names, that I would choose a name that was a little, I don't know, I was just scared I would somehow self-reveal. So I go into this chat room, and people are sharing some theories, and I gave an opinion that was very bland, And I got rounded on by users who told me in no uncertain terms just to get out. I'm not familiar in that room. I'm clearly an idiot who doesn't know anything. But I genuinely, I left. I left. And I was thinking, do you know what I promise you this is what I thought. I thought, I've written 3.5 books, I think it would have been at that time, where bullying is such a theme from the very first page, where bullying and authoritarian behavior is held to be one of the worst of human ills. And look what just happened. And these people who call themselves such fans of this franchise, what if I'd been a 12? I didn't care. Right. I was a pretty robust person. Right. But what if I'd been some 12-year-old who's excited to go into this room and is immediately caustically chastised for not belonging? Just kick someone out because they're new. And I thought that was so interesting, that you're passionate about these books, and yet in the course of living, you are behaving in a way that I depict as one of the worst and most dubious human behaviors.
This being the early days of the internet, it was also the early days of a kind of social behavior that we now generally know as trolling.
There were definitely individual trolls on the MuggleNet forums, purely there to be objectionable.
And even though they were just this small part of the community,
it was a fringe, but it was definitely there.
Rowling noticed that they did seem to have outsized power.
At first, I thought it's kind of amusing that this is how you're spending your time, but as time went on, I started to really see it as bullying. There was an edge of picking off vulnerable people. And I was very aware by that time, early 2000s, that a lot of kids who felt themselves to be outsiders, who were vulnerable, were finding themselves in Potter.
Why do you like Harry Potter?
He felt like an outsider and he felt like he didn't belong, and that really resonated with me.
Like, I had not such a great childhood, and I think a kid with not such a great childhood actually escaped to something else in a book.
Many of the people that like Harry Potter tend to be the ones outside, especially if you're a child that isn't well loved.
I felt protective of those people, so watching trolls operate in those spaces increasingly did not amuse me. It began to concern me.
Both of us had challenging, crappy upbringing and childhoods, and when you talk to people that are like the really crazy fans, that I feel like that's something that comes up more often than not.
And I think Harry Potter was one of the things that was just always there for people.
You grow up feeling like the weird one of the bunch, but then you realize there's so many other people out there like you, and then you don't feel so alone anymore, you know? So that's the best part about Harry Potter.
And indeed, actually ended up in long-term pen pal relationships with some of those people. You know, I can remember a situation where a young person had written a letter that resulted in my then assistant and I calling that child's school. We were very, very concerned that this child might be about to kill themselves. I just was hyper-aware, and I remain hyper-aware, that the Potter books were a refuge for some people who were, for very different reasons, very vulnerable.
One of the groups that really gravitated both to the Harry Potter books and to the online fandom were gay teenagers. The president of the Human Rights Campaign, the largest gay rights lobbying organization in the U.S., once referred to Rowling as a writer whose work has inspired countless LGBTQ young people to imagine a world of acceptance and inclusivity. Were you surprised by the way that gay teenagers in particular really started to connect with the books? Did that surprise you at all?
Honestly, it didn't, because the amazing thing about the wizarding world is you walk through that wall in Diagon Alley, and while human nature remains the same, and that's something that I was setting out to depict, human nature remains the same. If you can do magic, the ludicrous things that we discriminate about in the Muggle world really are utterly immaterial.
What do you think were the messages in your book that misfits, people who felt like outsiders, what messages were they connecting with?
I think that some of the most sympathetic characters, like Lupin, for example, who, is stigmatized through something that he can't help, can't control. Some of the most sympathetic characters are people who are grappling with things that may be stigmatized.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all imperfect. Harry has anger issues. Mm-hmm. Ron can be, I think I call him a git quite a lot in the books. But together they are more than the sum of their parts. Together they grow. They find family in each other. And there's real human beauty in that. I suppose the Dursleys are my epitome of a very authoritarian and conformist world that demands absolute obedience. And that's not the world you enter when you go to Hogwarts.
Our grade in school was the same year each book came out. So my exact class was almost grew up with Harry. Like we were 11 when Harry was 11. You know, as each book came out, these characters figured out a lot of normal life things right along with us.
Many fans credit the morals of the books with helping shape their morals growing up.
Friendship and loyalty and bravery and doing the right thing when the right thing is hard to do.
The way people pull together, they're different. They don't all exactly agree with one another, but they can say, okay, this is the common good and this is what we're going to work for. We need a whole lot more of that.
And as they got older and went from middle schoolers lined up at the midnight release parties to young adults heading off to college, some of those morals also became more mature.
Things like media literacy, understanding when maybe the media is lying to you and having to really think critically.
To many of these fans, Rowling became something of a moral authority in their lives, giving them this series to grow up with and being this figure that they could look up to.
I idolized her for a really long time.
She was a great feminist icon.
Online, we called her Jo because we felt like we were on a first-name basis. I think a lot of us actually kind of feel like she was our mom in some ways. She was just the mom of the Harry Potter fandom.
I became aware that I was, to an extent, becoming an idealized figure, and probably an idealized mother figure. And that is a complex position to find yourself in. And for me particularly, it's complex because I am a maternal person. It's not that they're seeing something in me that isn't there. And I have had quite maternal relationships with some individual fans who have been going through bad times. But to be idealized is not something I want. I am a human being. I couldn't have written these books if I weren't a human being and aware of human frailty and human imperfection. And I'm very aware that idealization comes at a price.
Last summer, in a grand celebration of literature, Harvard Square and Harvard Yard was transformed into Hogwarts Square. This summer festival celebrated the midnight release of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows.
I want to talk about your 2008 commencement address at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, you are about 10 years since the days you were struggling in that small flat. You had become one of the most beloved authors of all time, and you're speaking at the most prestigious school in America, arguably the world.
Her books have set sales records and have won many awards, probably because the Harry Potter stories provide a familiar backdrop for readers who can empathize with the young protagonist adrift in a sometimes cruel and challenging world.
And so at this point, for better or for worse, you do seem to be seen as a moral leader, and the person who introduces you says this actually.
In addition to her vast contributions to literature, she is also noted for the social, moral, and political inspiration she has given her fans. A notable philanthropist.
And it's a remarkable thing to go back and watch.
And now I give you Ms. J.K. Rowling.
You're up there, dressed in robes, standing in front of this generation that grew up alongside Harry Potter, and you're talking to them as they are launching into the world.
The first thing I would like to say is thank you. Not only has Harvard given me an extraordinary honor, but the weeks of fear and nausea I have endured at the thought of giving this commencement address have made me lose weight. On this wonderful day when we are gathered together to celebrate your academic success, I have decided to talk to you about the benefits of failure. And as you stand on the threshold of what is sometimes called real life, I want to extol the crucial importance of imagination.
And your speech is very personal and vulnerable.
Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that failure is fun. That period of my life was a dark one. So why do I talk about the benefits of failure? Simply because failure meant a stripping away of the inessential. I was set free because my greatest fear had been realized, and I was still alive, and I still had a daughter whom I adored, and I had an old typewriter and a big idea. And so rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life.
But you also challenge them.
Now, you might think that I chose my second theme, the importance of imagination, because of the part it played in rebuilding my life, but that is not wholly so. I have learned to value imagination in a much broader sense. In its arguably most transformative and revelatory capacity, it is the power that enables us to empathize with humans whose experiences we have never shared.
You tell them that they need to be empathetic to people who are not like them.
Unlike any other creature on this planet, human beings can learn and understand without having experienced. What is more, those who choose not to empathize enable real monsters, for without ever committing an act of outright evil ourselves, we collude with it through our own apathy. We do not need magic to transform our world. We carry all the power we need inside ourselves already. We have the power to imagine better.
And the crowd just goes wild. They love it. And they love you. But at this point, it's really hard to imagine that you would be welcome at Harvard at all, or that you'd get that kind of reception from that crowd.
From that crowd.
And what I want to understand from your point of view is what changed? And maybe when did you start to notice it changing?
I would say about a decade ago, I started to become very interested in what was going on online and concerned about what was going on online. I noticed a real shift.
We'll be right back. This podcast is supported by Moinkbox. Before I moved to a tiny farming community nearly a decade ago, I didn't really have a sense of where my food came from or how it was raised. Now I do, because I subscribe to Moinkbox. Yes, that's Moo plus Oink. I know a lot of family farmers, and Moink is a meat subscription box company on a mission to fight for the family farm. Located in rural America and run by an 8th-generation female farmer, Moink meat is better than what's at your typical grocery. Moink delivers grass-fed and grass-finished beef and lamb, pastured pork and chicken, and sustainable wild-caught Alaskan salmon straight to your door. As a working mom with an infant, a preschooler, and a full-time job, I will do anything to save time, energy, and brain space. And Moink is a hack I'd recommend to anyone. Keep American farming going by signing up at moinkbox.com/witchtrials right now, and listeners of this show get free bacon in your first box. It's some of the best bacon you'll ever taste, but only for a limited time. Spelled MOINK box.com/witchtrials. That's moinkbox.com/witchtrials.
Hi, listeners. I'm Barry Weiss, and I'm the host of Honestly, a podcast where disagreement doesn't equal dislike, and where we value frank and at times blunt conversations about the biggest questions facing our society. What does a country with a Second Amendment actually do about gun violence? Is social media addiction behind the rise in self-harm among kids? Do we need to radically rethink our political system in an age of polarization? And why is America so fat? Whether I'm talking to documentarian Ken Burns about American democracy, or the head of OpenAI, Sam Altman, about how technology is reshaping the world, or humorist David Sedaris on how to laugh in the face of tragedy, we always strive to have the most sincere and, yes, honest conversations you will find anywhere. Join us by subscribing to Honestly on whatever podcast app you're using right now. And thanks.
So in the early days of the internet, by definition, the people who were on there were going to be people who are really passionate about the future of computers.
This is writer and internet historian Angela Nagle.
People with a lot of imagination and maybe tendency towards utopian thinking.
The internet is for me the hope for humanity. The internet provides everybody a voice and the chance to be heard, which is the whole point about democracy.
They had an idea that the internet would bring democracy and freedom to the world, and that it would be impossible for dictatorships and tyranny to coexist with the internet.
In 2007, when Rowling released the final installment in the Harry Potter series, and in 2008, when she gave that address at Harvard, this was a time when internet usage around the world was exploding, both in terms of how many people were gaining access to the internet and in terms of how much we used it, especially because it coincided with the invention of the smartphone. And Nagle says that it was also a time when it seemed like some of those optimistic dreams of what the internet could usher in were coming true.
I guess the first manifestation that maybe proved to those utopians that they could be right is that you saw things like the Arab Spring, where protesters used social media to gather in public squares and protest dictatorships. And you also had the election of Barack Obama, which was very much seen as the internet generation's president.
I never thought in my lifetime that it would happen, but it happened tonight. It's a reality and we did it. America is now more united. We did it.
People were becoming more progressive and more multicultural. Also, there was this very powerful idea of the global village, all humanity as one, sort of in this one collective consciousness on the internet. But then, of course, inevitably, things started to go a little bit weird.
Nearly half of Americans say they feel more and more like a stranger in their own country.
Politics has, over the last few decades, increasingly empowered the extremes of political parties.
Can often be traced back to the rise of online extremism.
Elected officials have been shot at community meetings.
This increasing habit of demonizing political opponents creates a dangerous climate.
Is the internet killing democracy?
So, what happened? Many people blame this disruptive technology that we call social media, which over the last 2 decades went from something that barely existed at all to the single most powerful tool for communication in history, shaping our politics, our societies, and our sense of reality. Now, it is undeniable that social media has done tangible good, helping people like me expand our moral circle and find our partners and friends. Just a brief homage to social media from me. It was conversations on Twitter that helped me leave what many describe as a religious cult, and it also introduced me to my husband, the father of my 2 children. However, over the past few years, many, including some of the very optimists who helped design the internet as we know it today, have been outspoken in saying that social media has corrupted the dream of what the internet could do for the world. Like computer scientist Jaron Lanier, who argues that social media poses a real threat to a pluralistic society.
Society has been gradually darkened by this scheme in which everyone is under surveillance all the time, and everyone is under this mild version of behavior modification all the time. It's made people jittery and cranky. It's made teens especially depressed, which can be quite severe. But it's made our politics kind of unreal.
And he, along with former Google engineer Tristan Harris, have focused a lot of their concern around social media on the algorithms and the profit motives of big tech.
There's a tendency to think here that this is just human nature. No, that's just people are polarized, and this is just playing out. It's a mirror. It's holding up a mirror to society. But what it's really doing is it's an amplifier for the worst parts of us.
But far less attention has been paid to the question of where certain polarizing beliefs and norms began to gain a foothold online. And the answer turns out to be, in part, these small, strange, and fascinating corners of the internet. When you started writing and doing PhD research into these smaller, peculiar online subcultures, did people think you'd lost your mind?
Yeah, definitely. I had many, many arguments with people where they said, oh, what does this matter? It's just some people on the internet. It's not real life. And I kept telling people, no, you're getting this wrong. This is going to change the world. This is hugely important, and it's going to be massively impacting your life in a few years from now.
In 2017, Angela Nagel published a book called Kill All Normies, which helped explain the rise of the alt-right. But it also revealed, in a powerful way, this handful of online forums and websites, places on the internet that most people had never even heard of or spent any real time on, and how they've come to have a profound impact on almost every aspect of our politics and society.
So in my book, I focused on 2 main forums because I felt that they were possibly the most influential, and they also represented very politically different groups.
The first of these 2 forums was Tumblr.
I was fascinated by Tumblr culture. And for those who don't know, Tumblr is a microblogging website and is very popular with young women.
Which was also one of the key places where Rowling says she started to notice these changes online.
I started to be intrigued by the use of the word identify. This was something I was seeing rising in culture, particularly from the younger generation. And I don't see that as necessarily a malign thing, because I think we all have an identity, and identity is important to all of us for a stable sense of self. But I was noticing something that I thought was interesting and then that began to disturb me.
Tumblr went live in 2007, and it gained some popularity in the early 2010s. The whole idea of the site was built off of the popularity of blogging or online journaling. But unlike other blogging sites, Tumblr tapped into what would eventually make social media so addictive.
Tumblr is like Twitter, but longer, so you can reblog people's content.
Again, Helen Lewis, staff writer at The Atlantic.
So it has a kind of viral element to it, but it was also very image-based.
Tumblr was kind of a cross between Instagram and Twitter. And for early Tumblr users, it was just as addictive as those apps would eventually become. And these people on Tumblr largely fit into a few different groups. One of them was fans of Twilight and Doctor Who, and, of course, a ton of Harry Potter fans. But here, they no longer had to log into chat rooms or poke around message boards to connect with other fans, because on Tumblr, it was all in one big, scrollable feed.
And it became a big place for teenagers to hang out, to draw their own comics, to write their own fan fiction, to engage in all kinds of fandom, essentially, around these big properties.
It's also important to know that a lot of the people on Tumblr were anonymous, and over time, the site became inundated with porn.
The other big group that was on Tumblr were masturbators.
It's a very sexual environment because the moderation was like super loose. So that obviously is going to attract the attention of many different groups.
This is Catherine D., aka Default Friend, writer, internet historian, and admitted former Tumblr addict.
A lot of like fetishists and pornographers and sex workers. And you also have a lot of teenagers.
You know, it was a very odd place to be sometimes, Tumblr, because you would have this just endless porn interspersed with very cute kawaii comics and anime and very kind of infantilized cultures.
And you have a lot of like horny teenagers who are exploring their sexuality and they're drawing erotic fan art or they're even posting photos of themselves.
Years later, Tumblr would be singled out by law enforcement for being a major source of child pornography online, and that ultimately forced them to moderate their content. But back in the early 2010s, it was pretty much a free-for-all.
And then finally, you have the activists who are giving you new language to describe your experience, potentially giving you a sense of meaning.
Like other social media sites eventually would, Tumblr attracted a lot of activists. And in Tumblr's case, it was activism particularly around sex positivity and gender identity.
These groups had a huge influence on a lot of different subcultures that ended up forming on Tumblr. And all of that together really creates a tinderbox.
And so this place full of teenagers and activists and fans and fetishists and porn, it wasn't just a place where you could invent a new character in your Harry Potter fan fiction. It ultimately became a place where users could create and experiment with new identities for themselves.
The thing I remember thinking about it most is it was almost like a huge live action role-playing game.
Tumblr was a place that was allowing people to explore these new forms of identification.
I would say that Tumblr is probably most notorious for generating, hundreds of gender identities.
This is Natalie Wynn, a popular online commentator better known as ContraPoints.
I am a YouTuber. That is, I guess, a profession. And my videos are about social issues or politics or media. A lot of it has been focused on gender because I'm a transgender woman. I transitioned in 2017 and have been doing videos pretty consistently ever since. People still talk about, quote, Tumblr genders. Sometimes there's 76 genders. That was a meme for years.
You could be lumigender, that is having a gender that was, illuminating like a light, or ambigender, pangender, xenogender.
They really embraced this idea of genderqueer, which is, a word that was used before non-binary.
There was also a lot of talk about otherkin.
So otherkin were people who said that although they looked like they were human, they were actually wolves or dragons. And they were quite insistent about this, that this was an identity that you could adopt.
This is where you get people who say things like, my gender is a cloud.
How much of it was just playfulness and how much appeared to be like sincere self-discovery?
Well, I think that playfulness is part of self-discovery.
Natalie Wynn appreciated this aspect of Tumblr, and she says that it's exactly why some people like her were drawn to the site.
For a lot of young queer people, engaging in this imaginative play about all the possibilities of gender was like a way for them to experiment with different imaginative possibilities or what's possible with gender.
There was a culture that was encouraged on Tumblr, which was to be able to describe your unique, non-normative self.
Again, Angela Nagel.
And that's, to some extent, a feature of modern society anyway, but it was taken to such an extreme that people began to describe this as the snowflake, the person who constructs a totally kind of boutique and unique identity for themselves and then guards that identity in a very, very sensitive way. and reacts in an enraged way when anyone does not respect the uniqueness of their identity.
And Nagel says that these norms around identity and this increased sensitivity to identities of all kinds, it spread across huge swaths of Tumblr.
So that was very much the culture of Tumblr. And at the same time, you had on the other side of the political spectrum, you could say, the most insensitive culture imaginable, which was the culture of 4chan.
Dicks out for Harambe, you know what the fuck it is.
And the culture of 4chan was really based around transgression and offensiveness and the kind of fun of being offensive.
About like 30 to 45 minutes ago, I beat the fuck out of my dick so goddamn hard that I can't even feel my left leg. My left leg has went...
You know, the entire culture became a sort of a one-upmanship of who can post the most outrageous or offensive thing imaginable. And so they're going to make Holocaust jokes and they're going to make Anne Frank jokes.
Making an ethno-state is hard work.
I mean, you really gotta ask yourself, what eugenics programs are you going to use?
What type of plumbing to use in your internment camps?
So 4chan, if you've never heard of it, it was actually somewhat similar to Tumblr in that it was largely anonymous and text and image-based. There were a lot of fans there, especially anime, and it had lots of porn and lots of young people. But where Tumblr attracted a lot of girls and women, 4chan skewed way more male. Back in 2014, 4chan made headlines after users there pulled this stunt that generated some panic about how hackers were able to access people's private photos in the cloud.
Several A-list stars are the target of what appears to be one of the biggest celebrity hacking leaks. Dozens of private nude photographs were apparently accessed from phones and leaked online.
Jennifer Lawrence and several other celebrities had their personal nude photos stolen out of the cloud and leaked on 4chan.
Do we even know who is this 4chan person or website?
He may, and I'm sure we're gonna be able to get
where users shared and sold the nudes, made GIFs and memes out of them, and celebrated how much attention this got. So, in a lot of ways, the norms and mores of Tumblr and 4chan end up being these kind of mirror images of one another.
You have this kind of reinforcing culture of ultra-sensitivity on one side, and this reinforcing culture of anti-sensitivity on the other side, and both of these cultures are growing at the same time.
If you've ever heard a kind of right-wing activist railing against woke culture, then you'll be hearing them condemning phrases that were popularized on Tumblr.
Microaggression,
trigger warnings,
Latinx, non-binary, two-spirit, transgender.
You know, even the idea of being cis as opposed to being trans, you know, the idea that everybody was one of those two things.
If you dig through the Wayback Machine or Google Analytics, you can see that many of these words and phrases that have become pretty mainstream on the political left and have become the focus of a lot of backlash from the political right, many of them can be traced back to their increased use on Tumblr.
People start Googling them between 2011 and 2014. That's when you see the first spike.
And this is also the same period when the use of social media in general was exploding. So more and more people were spending more and more of their time on these platforms. And you can go back and kind of watch how these ideas start to migrate outward from Tumblr.
So a good example of this is the word Latinx, right? If you look at early articles about the word Latinx, so these are articles that are coming out between 2013 and 2015, a lot of them reference Tumblr. Gabby Riviera of Autostraddle wrote, "The word Latinx has been appearing on my Tumblr dashboard for the last year." The website Latino Rebels also ran an article about the term, and they were like, this word comes from Tumblr, and we don't like it. It's from the American blogosphere, and nobody in Latin America uses it.
Even though some of these ideas were openly mocked by many people, others became quite mainstream quite quickly. So like when Facebook announced it was suddenly offering like 40 different gender identities and a lot of people were confused, do you think it's right to say that essentially they were just catching up to what Tumblr had been doing for years at that point?
Oh, of course. Facebook was definitely playing catch up.
The idea of privilege was very big. You know, the idea that you have white privilege, male privilege, cis privilege, that really came from Tumblr and has had a sort of odd effect on discourse ever since.
And things that we wouldn't have recognized as being offensive suddenly were considered offensive. There's a real culture of like calling not only people, but media properties and the creators of those media properties problematic on Tumblr.
And so that's really where you get cancel culture in a sense, which takes sensitivity and the strengthening of taboos to such a point that anyone who transgresses them should be just totally removed from the conversation.
People online did discover that there is a kind of clout to be gained from discovering what is problematic about a popular figure. So there used to be a Tumblr blog called Your Fave is Problematic.
Your Fave is Problematic was a Tumblr account created in 2013 by an anonymous American high school student. Initially, it was just a place where she would call out celebrities and artists, as well as their hardcore fans on Tumblr.
It was just like a list of celebrities or popular figures and all of their sort of social justice sins.
There'd be a call out of Jennifer Lawrence, who wore fake dreads for a photo shoot, or Tina Fey for a rape joke on 30 Rock.
You know, Justin Bieber did cultural appropriation in this, and Miley Cyrus did that, and so if you like them, you're a terrible person.
But quickly, and to this high school Tumblr user's surprise, the account grew massively popular on Tumblr, and it started to create these real backlashes, leading to big stars issuing apologies. And these fandoms that were such a big presence on Tumblr, they were increasingly turning on the very creators of the books and films and television shows that they were such big fans of. Whether it was Stephenie Meyer, who wrote the Twilight series and was accused of being racist, or Anne Rice, who was accused of sexism.
So if this is happening over and over and over again, and people are on other parts of the internet are making fun of Tumblr constantly about it.
And J.K. Rowling was not immune.
First Rowling backlash was in 2016, when she wrote about Native American wizards, and she wrote about skinwalkers, this idea of malevolent wizards who disguise themselves as animals. And the outcry then was about cultural appropriation, which is a very Tumblr concern, cultural appropriation, the idea that, you know, you're borrowing bits and pieces from other cultures. You know, you're going to a music festival and you're wearing a Native American headdress or whatever it might be. And so in 2016, J.K. Rowling was accused of Native American appropriation, of appropriating another culture. And that was the first time I thought, she is no longer left-wing enough for her fans. That's interesting.
Do you remember how it felt when you first started to see those things?
I definitely saw it in the context of this is happening everywhere. So I didn't take it super personally, but I was seeing this happen across the board to artists, and there was a kind of Puritanism that was rising that to me seemed very illiberal, so very contrary, I suppose, to my values, to my core values. So yeah, it happened to me. I was watching it happening to other artists. I was watching it happening to other sort of properties, creative properties, and it was inevitable I was going to be hit with it too. Was it enjoyable? No. Did I take it really personally? No. That's the honest answer.
Cancel culture is probably as old as humanity in a way, but in the style of the internet, I think Tumblr was very, very central to that.
Your Fave is Problematic, even at the peak of its popularity, only had around 50,000 followers. The fans who turned on these different creators, they didn't represent anything close to the majority view of the artist in the hot seat, or even the average fan's views. But then, when the battles on Tumblr became enmeshed on another platform, its effects became much more far-reaching.
It's only when it gets to Twitter that it's this monster that is a complete runaway train.
Twitter is like, I don't know, it's like being on the National Mall. It's like being in Times Square. That's where you're having these fights, right? Like the biggest public forum. You know, every journalist in the world is on Twitter practically, and politicians are on it, public figures are on it. So that really changes the dynamic. When it's not fandom wars, it's like Twitter is politics, full stop.
Twitter had two things that Tumblr lacked. One was a much larger user base, and the other was the presence of a huge number of journalists from around the world. Those journalists began to pick up these stories, publishing them in mainstream media outlets. And so this small group of people, shaped by the norms of Tumblr, appeared to have a much bigger presence in society than it actually did. That gave them more of an ability to influence politics, and it also fueled an aggressive backlash from places like 4chan.
No! Social justice warrior.
4chan users delighted in developing new ways to inflict reputational damage on people, who they saw as embodying these values from Tumblr.
A very common thing, for example, was raiding a person's Wikipedia page and filling it up with negative material, or putting out like fake revenge pornography, spreading outrageous lies about people.
They made fake accounts and photoshopped pictures and videos. They targeted people in the media, who they saw as perpetuating the culture of sensitivity Tumblr, giving more and more power to that side of the debate. Users on 4chan started doxing them, swatting their houses, and sending them death threats.
That was sort of very common from the, let's say, anti-political correctness side. But then on the other side, you also had things like getting people fired for a joke that was a bit off color. You know, publicly shaming people for something that they said many years previous that it has since become politically incorrect.
Is this like the phenomenon of digging up old tweets?
Yes, digging up old tweets. Or one example would be something like you find a picture of somebody and they're white and they're wearing a traditional Chinese dress, right, at, you know, an event. And somebody says this is cultural appropriation. Those kind of deliberate attempts to use public shaming and moral pressure to destroy people's livelihoods and careers.
And Nagel says that over time, the tactics and norms that emerged from these subcultures that felt embattled, they began to really shape the language and norms of internet culture more broadly.
And so we had to deal with a new sort of mean, cruel quality to the internet. What's fascinating about this is that the sensitive, politically correct culture of Tumblr is driven to greater and greater extremes because they see the enemy culture that comes from places like 4chan. And likewise, the culture of 4chan is sort of inspired to become more and more extreme because they see the culture of Tumblr. And so both are not only reinforcing the culture within their communities, but by observing the other side, they feel more like their political project is necessary. And therefore they have to become more and more extreme in order to fight this evil in the world.
You've talked about what you've described as a witch hunt impulse when it comes to the dynamics of online cancel culture. What is that impulse, and what parallels do you draw maybe to the witch hunts of old?
Well, I think that there's a lot of sources of aggression. I think that aggression is a basic human instinct. I think there's a lot of kind of free-form aggression in search of a target.
Natalie Wynn has a video with the title Cancel Culture, where she goes into detail about what she sees as some of the underlying and very human impulses inspiring people on Tumblr and beyond.
Freud discusses this, like morality can be sadistic, the sadistic superego, he calls it. And the idea is that you kind of use that kind of punishing, shaming, moral condemnation, that becomes an outlet for aggression in itself. And so I think for people, it can become a way to attack someone while also kind of feeling good about themselves, which is a very I think, tempting place to be, right? You're trashing someone, but you feel like you're crusading.
I was starting to think about this a lot. Subcultures that have their own rigid rules, acceptable beliefs, non-acceptable beliefs, everything becoming very reductive. I was also deeply concerned by it because to me it was a rise of the kind of authoritarianism and lack of empathy that it's in all of my books. It's in literally every book I write. Mm-hmm. If there's one thing that I stand against more than any other, it is authoritarianism. And that cuts across political persuasions, cuts through atheists all the way through to various different religions. So I was definitely seeing that. And I was becoming really concerned. I think the first time I became really interested in what was going on, sort of culturally.
I've taken some time out of my busy schedule, being fabulous and doing my hair, to prepare a speech for you. Well, a few remarks, really.
It was Milo Yiannopoulos.
Feminism is cancer. Thank you very much.
The outright provocateur, I suppose you would call him.
In 2016, this battle online really started to move offline. And for many people, the person who signaled this shift was an editor from Breitbart, who essentially was the culture of 4chan in human form, Milo Yiannopoulos.
I think Milo Yiannopoulos was very much an embodiment of the moment where the culture of places like 4chan sort of bursts into the mainstream.
As Milo was booked to speak on college campuses, he was increasingly met with protesters demanding that he be stopped, leading to real political violence.
And I'm watching from across the pond as he tries to speak on various campuses, and there are protests, riots.
Campus locked down as more than 1,000 people rallied against the appearance of a controversial editor from Breitbart, Milo Yiannopoulos.
We want him deplatformed. We don't want him to speak at all.
They're using free speech as a justification to have these fascists come to Berkeley.
And I thought it was a terrible strategic error.
Overnight mayhem on campus. The University of California, Berkeley erupting in flames as over 1,000 came out to protest.
And my feeling was, you are giving this man way more power than he deserves by behaving in this way. It made Milo look sexier and edgier than he deserved to look.
Is there anybody in here who hates me? Yes, there we go. Thank you.
I thought it was a strategically appalling turn. Get on that platform and eviscerate his ideas. Get on that platform and expose him for the charlatan that he is. You push back hard, but you've given him so much power by refusing to talk.
Milo went from relative obscurity to being a regular on primetime television and political talk shows in just a few months.
You know, I have marched in my life. I've certainly been part of mass movements. I've signed petitions and I've demonstrated in certain ways. But when it comes to a speaker like that, I just thought they were undermining their own ends. In fact, I thought they were serving his purposes because he was able to walk away from that saying, look, they don't dare debate me. This is how dangerous and edgy I am. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we want to cast the alt-right in that light, but inadvertently.
That's exactly what they're doing.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Rowling says that she was alarmed watching people who she saw as being on her side of the political aisle behaving in a way that she felt broke with her deeply held principles, even when the target was someone who she agreed was offensive and immoral and a political opponent. And she started to think that maybe this was something she needed to speak up about.
I was becoming unnerved by some of what I was seeing. I thought the way this activist movement is behaving is troubling me.
But then, she started to see that it wasn't just her political opponents who were being treated this way.
I was starting to see activists behaving in a very aggressive way outside feminist meetings.
The
These are trans activists protesting outside a feminist meeting. They're shouting TERF. It stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists.
Like, what were they doing?
There was a feminist meeting in which they were banging and kicking on windows, very threatening. They were masked. Which, frankly, is never a good look. If you're a good guy, you're probably not going to be standing there in a black balaclava. I watched that happening and I was deeply disturbed because now this movement that I started being interested in, now this is really happening. It's playing out very fast.
Fuck you! Fuck you, you ugly piece of shit! You look like you got your teeth knocked out, you fucking fascist! Nobody knows who you are and nobody cares and you will die alone! You will die alone and you will burn in hell!
You've been listening to The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, produced by Andy Mills, Matthew Bull, and me, Megan Phelps-Roper, and brought to you by The Free Press. Our sincere thanks to you for listening, and we would love to listen to you too. If you have any thoughts or questions for us, you can send us an email at witchtrials@thefp.com.